The U.S. narrowly escaped destruction twice in 1997 alone. On two occasions in 1997 the United States would have been utterly destroyed by the die-hard faction of the KGB, except for direct countering by a friendly little foreign nation. The present author and three colleagues played a very minor role by alerting that nation to the impending attacks. There was certainly no reason to contact officials of our own country. The US was and is powerless to prevent such attacks, although hopefully that is changing. It made much better sense contact the only nation that could possibly avert our impending disaster. Of course we later also informed proper US government officials of our actions. The first strategic attack was scheduled for between early to mid-February, and involved, 1. Dudding all nuclear weapons, 2. Striking the quantum potential weapons in the little nation simultaneously, as well as extant scalar interferometer weapon sites in other foreign nations, and 3. Then leisurely blasting cities, facilities, and installations with iterative and continued scalar interferometer strikes. This third phase would include work assigned to the Yakuza Aum Shinrikyo teams. That is how the Yakuza, and Aum Shinrikyo, expected to revenge themselves for the Western defeat of Japan in World War II, and for the West's dropping the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. To be able to get in on the kill is why the Aum Shinrikyo and Yakuza leased the scalar, longitudinal electromagnetic wave, interferometers from the Russians in the first place. These, along with negative energy electromagnetic pulse weapons, are the kind of energetics weaponry that now determines our fate, and against which the US presently has still inadequate defenses. Our own scientific community does not believe such weapons even exist, apparently due to the not invented here syndrome. Most of the US scientific community is thus relatively useless and outdated as far as contributing to the strategic survival of the United States is concerned. Purpose of the novel attack on Captain Button. Hopefully, some scientists are aware of the strange incident that involved the mental seizure of Captain Button in his A-10 and controlling him for well over an hour, including controlling his perceptions, intent, and actions while performing complex technical tasks. That was the test of a KGB psychoenergetics weapon, developing and to be deployed by the KGB. That was the acceptance test, so to speak, deliberately conducted over the United States for the KGB's system that would be produced in numbers sufficient to counter the quantum potential weaponry, if the quantum potentials of the little friendly nation were to be placed in the insane command and control mode. This was yet another Soviet counter, planned for the near future against the counter by which the little nation did force abortion of the KGB second attack, scheduled for May 1, in 1997. The purpose of the attack on Captain Button can be understood as follows: the later second scheduled strategic attack on the US scheduled for May 1, 1997 was forcibly aborted after the friendly defending nation switched to an insane command and control mode. The insane C3 mode counters the Mind Snapper type attack that instantly kills all on-site operators and renders the sites too hot for new personnel to come in from outside and control it. In short, the US could have been destroyed in that scheduled May 1 attack, but with the change of the friendly quantum potential weapons to insane C3, Russia would also have perished in the immediate quantum potential counterblow from the little nation that would have been automatically delivered by the side weapons themselves. The May 1 attack had been predicated upon the fact that a preliminary Mind Snapper, negative energy electromagnetic pulse, attack on the friendly quantum potential weapon sites would have instantly killed all persons on site, and neutralized the site for some months because of the resulting longitudinal electromagnetic radiation. However, the shift of the C3 of the quantum potential weapons to insane mode rendered such a preemptive Mind Snapper attack totally ineffective because Russia would still have been destroyed. Hence another countering means was required, and in fact that additional system was already in development. It was a very sophisticated array of psychoenergetic weapons, each with a special, highly trained team of operators capable of fully controlling one targeted individual while he was directed and controlled to go about performing desired technical tasks. We estimate that it required one psychoenergetic weapon, very complex, multiple transmitters, and an operator team of perhaps 20 to 30 skilled operators, one for each major human function to be controlled, to adequately control the mind and actions of one distant person performing quite technical tasks. Hence several hundred such weapon sets were required to take over all persons on the targeted quantum potential weapons sites in the friendly nation, have the controlled crews deactivate the quantum potential weapons including using the security code and procedures to stand down for maintenance, etc. Once the quantum potential weapons were totally on stand down, then the mind snapper would have struck suddenly and killed every living thing on site, neutralizing the site for several months due to subsequent strong longitudinal electromagnetic wave emissions from the struck site. No new crews could have entered the site and lived, so the sites could not be operated after mind snapping, even though the quantum potential weapons were still intact but just on standby. Of course, a third phase then would have involved strikes by scalar electromagnetic interferometers to leisurely and completely destroy the systems and sites, permanently taking out the physical system as well. With the first two of that three-part series of strikes completed successfully, then the KGB weapon sites would have been absolutely free to blast North America and our European allies into smoking ruins, leisurely and at will, given the first 10 minutes of dudding all nuclear warheads worldwide, to take care of that old type of dead man fusing. From the open reports of the Button incident, and from the kill of Captain Svoboda a few weeks later, the nature of the next strategic attack that would be scheduled was immediately apparent. Accordingly, we warned the little nation about the shift to a new attack plan, and estimated the new schedule between mid-1999 and the 1st of 2000. Of course, we also passed that information on to our government as well, but apparently, no one believed it. The proper U.S. intelligence agencies, however, certainly intercepted my faxes to the little nation's military attaché in Washington, D.C., and particularly my fax a few days before May 1, sent directly to the Prime Minister of that nation and urging the change to an insane command and control system for the quantum potential weapons and the reason why. It turned out that, some months after I alerted them to the coming psychoenergetics, mind snapper, and scalar interferometry attack in that order, to be scheduled between mid to end of 1999, apparently the friendly nation suddenly struck and utterly destroyed the KGB facilities for the mind control negative energy electromagnetic pulse weapons being painfully built up in sufficient number. Probably scalar interferometry weapons were used to destroy them. The on-site psychoenergetics crews and facilities were destroyed and neutralized completely. Anyway, as we passed mid-1999, the type of Y2K problem we were worrying about was whether or not the attack was on, headlined by a psychoenergetics weapon strike on the little nation first, with the three phases as previously scheduled back in 1997. Later, in early 1999 I realized the Russian KGB development of the causal system robots, mentioned in the introduction. In the latter part of the third quarter of the year, working at my computer at night, I was struck by one of these very beasts from within my computer, figure 20, in very bizarre but unmistakable fashion, previously detailed. In 10 seconds I was nearly killed and severely disabled for a period of time. It took 4 days to recover completely. Because of the features deliberately utilized by the causal system robot on my computer screen so I would recognize it, I grasped the nature of the attack the KGB wanted me to recognize it, and lived to tell about it. How it was done, how it jammed the brain and vision center and strongly fibrillated the heart, upset the equilibrium, etc. I also realized that, in 20 seconds or so additional exposure, I would have been a very dead person, expiring with a very violent heart attack and severe brain embolisms. Note that the causal system robot deliberately struck directly from the computer screen through my retinas and onto the nervous system, passing through the vision center and flashing it tremendously, and jamming my mind, brain, and nervous system. When I recovered shakily about 4 days later, I notified the small nation, once again, as best I could, giving the exact symptoms of the attack and explaining what it was. By then I knew what was coming down, the form it would take, and the deceptive cover, Y2K uncorrected errors. The little nation then quickly proceeded to search out apparently inside the North American signals, potentials, fields, and waves superhighways for the causal system robots, all the causal system robots, and destroy them in place. It turns out to be a fairly straightforward operation, once one possesses advanced longitudinal electromagnetic wave interferometry weapons and techniques. Locating a very dense and very dynamic set of longitudinal waves performing organized functions is analogous to a normal radar locating a large bomber in cloud cover. One burst from the longitudinal wave radar, and the targeted causal system robots is completely disrupted and electronically destroyed. So a very short, lasting a few days, and strange strategic battle was fought in info-LD space or subspace, inside our electrical and electrical systems and inside the fields, potentials, and waves in them. A mighty attacking armada of perhaps several million main battle systems was intercepted and destroyed throughout our homeland, without the slightest notice by our own government, scientific, and intelligence communities. And without a whimper of what is usually recognized as combat actions. Afterwards, a very simple and innocuous little message was received which, reading between the lines, simply meant thank you very much. In short, my hard-pressed colleagues and I got a small attaboy for our role in alerting the friendly nation. So Y2K and the Millennium Celebration came, while we waited to see if the causal system robots were gone or if they would erupt with damage all over the US. Fortunately, they were gone like popping balloons, and so the fourth scheduled strategic attack upon the US in the space of 3 years this time actually launched was successfully destroyed. Whatever I can do to help the survival of my country I will continue to do without hesitation, regardless of whether the US scientific, intelligence, and military communities are aware of the new threat or not, and regardless of whether they believe it or not. Presently our fate and that of the Western world rests on the shoulders of a small but advanced and friendly nation. That is beginning to change, it seems, but still not swiftly enough to suit our needs. We simply must change all that, by developing quantum potential weapons and defenses ourselves. It is not an option. As an example, China has now finished as of earlier 2002 and deployed quantum potential weapons. Almost simultaneously, China also finished and deployed the more powerful negative energy electromagnetic pulse mind snapper type but much more powerful weapons and deployed them as well. So we have entered a very dangerous period when the strategic changes that are likely to occur will be both massive and traumatic. As this is being written in early October 2002, it is obvious that our nation is also preparing to strike Iraq if need be, either with a coalition effort or alone. If so, then Saddam Hussein will certainly unleash whatever terrorist forces he has in North America. He will attempt to unleash upon us all the weapons of mass destruction at his command. This could even happen within the next 30 days, with the Middle East exploding, giant polarization of the Arab world, general chaos in the Middle East and upset of world oil supplies, and skyrocketing fuel and energy costs with severe impact upon the already seriously ailing US stock market. If Saddam Hussein succeeds in doing sufficient damage to our cities and energy infrastructure with more weapons of mass destruction than we have credited him with, then the potential economic collapse of the United States and much of the developed world is an uncomfortable possibility. If that happens, turf wars will erupt all over the world economy may collapse, the KGB and rogue Japanese, Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo, will move and unleash further destruction, Pakistan and India are likely to erupt into a nuclear war, and several other regions may also erupt into nuclear war and use weapons of mass destruction. What China might do in such event is anybody's guess. In short, the Armageddon we have so long feared, with the resulting collapse or destruction of much of civilization, could well be approaching. Let us hope that dark picture is terribly, terribly wrong, and that we successfully avoid Armageddon one more time. Meanwhile, we would be in much better shape to weather the coming storm had our scientific community not grossly betrayed us. But if and when millions of Americans are dying in the streets with no effective means of treatment, and no effective defenses to prevent onslaught after onslaught against our nation, all those deaths and all that suffering will be directly the fault of our own organized scientific community. Rogue Japanese, Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo, have a role. In the information briefing furnished the previously named agencies, we briefly detailed the elements of the attack, how our own nuclear weaponry can be done anywhere, etc. We also detailed the strange role of the Japanese Yakuza and the Aum Shinrikyo, who leased the operational use of the early generations of KGB longitudinal wave interferometry weapons in 1990 directly from the KGB. The first down payment on the lease was $900 million. I previously furnished pertinent information on this to an investigative U.S. government agency. Since then, the Yakuza have set up their own scalar interferometry weapons development facilities in Japan, including portable energetics weapons, and have assumed a very secret and nearly unsuspected role somewhat similar to bin Laden's role in the attacks of September 11, 2001, but much more deadly when the coming Armageddon erupts, inducing the Gulf War disease. In 1986, the Russians had already solved the dead man fusing problem theoretically, but had not yet completed the development and deployment of the necessary quantum potential weaponry. The KGB's first combat demonstration test of the ability to localize a quantum potential in a selected region of space was against the US air attack on Libya in 1986. That test apparently used a laboratory apparatus to prove the process. In short, it was a major milestone whose success moved the system into full production engineering and production. The system was then developed at very high speed after the successful demonstration in 1986. The first strategic KGB quantum potential weapon, S, became operational on site in latter 1989. It was this quantum potential weapon that was used to generate the so-called Gulf War disease in our soldiers in the Mideast. In the action package, I explained precisely how that was done. I have also finally placed the simplified gist of that explanation openly on the internet for all to see, website www.shenieri.org. Those suffering U.S. veterans were casualties of war, not victims of nerve gas whiffs or chemicals or their own stress, etc. The initial U.S. government and U.S. scientific community's assertion that it was all in their heads and due to stress, insults every veteran who has ever served his nation. One justifiably has contempt for such treatment of our veterans. Sadly, the latest studies are beginning to conclude the same thing once again. Apparently our intelligence and military command agencies have not yet learned the lesson of the decades-long Soviet microwave radiation of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, which was responsible for health changes of many kinds in U.S. personnel and was also responsible for the deaths of 3 U.S. ambassadors to the Soviet Union. Apparently we are still using radar engineers and electrical engineers for electrodynamics analysis, and these analysts apparently still believe that in the absence of the electromagnetic fields there can be no induced electromagnetic effects. One sadly comments that, just as the electrical engineering departments of our universities have been unable to walk across the campus to the particle physics department and find out what the discovery of broken symmetry in 1957 portends for their discipline and model, then the intelligence community apparently has not yet learned that no electromagnetic analysis of such things as the microwave radiation of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow or the shoot-down of the TWA-800 is worth a tinker's damn unless it is a higher group symmetry electromagnetic analysis. As Barrett showed, our fellows still have not grasped what Nikola Tesla already accomplished in actual patented circuits circa 1900 and shortly thereafter. Tensor analysis and vector analysis simply will not show what is really there. Our veterans were hit with a cocktail mix of specialized disease space-time curvature engines just below the observable threshold, in shadow, virtual, but nearly observable, state. The immune systems and the cellular regenerative systems do react to that shadow state level. Interferometer or quantum potential weapons put in the disease templates for 20 diseases, deliberately kept in the shadow state magnitude. Immune system reacts to all 20 pre-disease conditions. Such a simultaneous mixed shadow induction spreads the reacting finite immune system and regenerative system and their resources all across that entire mix of shadow diseases, so that only a much smaller portion of the immune system and of the regenerative system is directed against any one of the shadow diseases. This in turn greatly heightens, by a factor of 5 or more, the susceptibility of the body to all additional disease pathogens, and it greatly lowers the ability of the body to recover from any disease or biological warfare strike. In addition, the exposed veteran's body fluids and masses have accumulated a persistent time-density charging that very slowly decays, by emission of weak longitudinal electromagnetic waves, over months or even a few years. The sperm from these veterans did indeed have the innate engines and therefore the capability to gradually infect their wives. So did the saliva in their mouths. The weak dimensioned longitudinal wave radiation from their bodies could also slowly alter the cellular regeneration and immune systems of their family members in close proximity, over a period of time, thus inducing the disease in them. The induction of Gulf War syndrome in our troops was in fact a test for the present clandestine use already ongoing of that technique to spread the immune and regenerative systems of the targeted U.S. population. This in turn gradually makes us more susceptible to terrorist biological warfare attacks and disease pathogens of all types from anyone else. This tactic is already in place and accomplished, and it will substantially increase the American civilian casualties in our cities when they are subjected to terrorist biological warfare attacks in the near future. Those attacks now will have some 5 times the effectiveness that our present planners estimate. In short, it is going to ensure the deaths of millions more Americans. The approaching war in the Middle East, with Saddam Hussein's unleashing of his terrorist assets in the U.S. to the maximum extent possible, thus will probably see a 5-fold increase in the effectiveness of some of his mass destruction weapons that Hussein's assets are able to unleash on America. The entire affair of the Gulf War disease was both a preliminary test and also a magnificent intelligence probe by the KGB, to clearly demonstrate once again that the U.S. government and the U.S. scientific community are still nearly totally unknowledgeable of quantum potential weaponry, immune and regenerative system spreading, disease induction by bioenergetics means, etc. It follows a methodology used with great success for 4 decades by the KGB, and one that our own government, scientific community, and military community has yet to decipher. So long as the threat only slowly increases, Americans remain complacent in their ignorance, ignoring the boa constrictor slowly strangling them, while awaiting the cobras seen in the distance. We have unwittingly cooperated with the KGB boa constrictor for 4 decades, even as it slowly prepared to crush us. In the Gulf War, that crushing moved to the next threshold, to actually inflict casualties and deaths on U.S. troops and totally get away with it because of the bioenergetics, in the Russian sense, ineptness of the U.S. scientific community. 40 years of Russian induction of diseases in U.S. embassy personnel. Sadly, our own fellows have never even figured out how the diseases and health changes were previously induced by the KGB for decades in personnel in the former American embassy in Moscow. 3 U.S. ambassadors to the Soviet Union died as a result of their exposure to that radiation. Many other Americans on site were made ill or suffered health changes. When Johns Hopkins scientists studied the problem, they found a most anomalous thing: no health changes occurred in areas where the electromagnetic force fields existed in the microwave radiation. Instead, the health changes only occurred in areas where the potentials were gradient-free so that the force fields were zero and thus the potentials, and their specific internal engines, were persistent. Using only a classical M-force field analysis which does not show any of the internal longitudinal electromagnetic wave substructuring of the fields, potentials, and waves, the Johns Hopkins scientists erroneously concluded that it could not have been the weak microwave radiation causing the health difficulties, because no such health difficulties occurred where the force fields were present. That is, they very naively assumed that no force fields meant no electromagnetic effects were possible. Their entire findings thus were based on a total non sequitur, the assumption that there can be no electromagnetically induced physical changes in matter in the absence of fields. The Aharonov-Bohm effect alone falsifies that entire premise. So does general relativity and higher group symmetry electrodynamics. Actually, the Johns Hopkins scientists had just clearly proven the exact opposite, that it indeed was the radiation that induced the health changes. That is simply shown statistically, and it is a deep and continuing mystery how good scientists and their governmental overwatch did not notice the violation of inference methodology. Simply put, there was 100% correlation to the presence of gradient-free electromagnetic potentials, the persistent kind. There was zero correlation, or 100% anti-correlation, to the presence of the normal electric and magnetic fields, i.e., where the potentials changed over a very small region of space. Hence it could only have been the constant potentials, else we must throw out statistical inference theory altogether. If the changes had not been caused by the electromagnetic radiation at all, one would have had some health changes in regions where fields were present and some health changes where the fields were absent. Considering the lengthy time the radiation persisted and the number of personnel affected, the statistics are decisive. Without question, the cause was indeed the persistent potentials where the force fields were zero. Whittaker's two papers, one in 1903 and the other in 1904, would then show how it was done. The 1904 paper and superpotential theory alone would not have explained it, since that alone does not include the information content of the field, i.e., space-time curvature engines info LD'd inside the normal electromagnetic potentials, fields, and waves. So, the US government and US scientific community botched it badly, unfortunately, by elemental statistical inference standards. And unfortunately, they have continued to botch it to this day. Both the scientific community and the intelligence community missed it. Elementary statistics theory alone, coupled with the Johns Hopkins results, clearly indicates that the microwave radiation was causing the health changes, to a very high degree of confidence. This demonstrates how totally inexplicable some of the effects generated by longitudinal electromagnetic wave interferometry and by structured or dimensioned potentials, fields, and waves can seem to our conventional scientists. If we examine the serious foundations flaws in classical electrodynamics and electrical engineering taught in our universities, and the near-total lack of higher group symmetry electrodynamics training, we can understand why our scientists and intelligence analysts did not and do not have the background required to properly assess the incidents and effects. Western electrodynamics is in sad shape actually, numerous scientists have long pointed this out. For example, quoting Mario Bunge, "It is not usually acknowledged that electrodynamics, both classical and quantal, are in a sad state. In quantum electrodynamics, it is the potentials that are the primary causes of all electromagnetic phenomena, not the force fields as used by Johns Hopkins and the government in its analysis. We know that classical electromagnetic is wrong in its focus upon force fields as primary electromagnetic causes. The Aharonov-Bohm effect, Berry phase, and geometric phase work in some 20,000 papers in the physics literature already show that. Indeed, we also know that the classical force fields do not even exist apart from mass. In space, only the potential for such a force field exists, in case some charged matter is brought in to interact with the electromagnetic entity as it exists in mass-free space, as curvatures of space-time. The Aharonov-Bohm effect and its implications have been published in Physical Review, our most prestigious physics journal since 1959. Later publications have included the Berry phase extension of the Aharonov-Bohm effect, and Aharonov and Anandon's further extension of the Berry phase to what is today called the geometric phase. The potentials are indeed the primary electromagnetic causes, and the force fields do not even exist as such in mass-free space, but only in mass. Yet our classical electromagnetic taught in our universities has not been changed in its fundamental acceptance of the material ether since 1865. Every university in America is still teaching and defending a rather mangled electrodynamics where, 1. The material ether is still assumed, even though destroyed more than a century ago by the Michelson-Morley experiments. The force fields are erroneously assumed to exist in mass-free space, but in force-free form when what actually exists there as an electromagnetic disturbance is a general relativistic perturbation of spacetime, i.e., an oscillation of the local curvature of spacetime. Actually, force identically is the time rate of change of momentum, where momentum is mass times velocity. Thus mass is a component of force and force field. There is no force or force field without mass. As Feynman put it, there is no force field in massless space. Instead, there is only the potential for such a force field to be formed at the various points, should a charged mass be placed at, added to, each of them. 3. The source charges are erroneously assumed to create their fields and potentials and all that energy in them, reaching across the entire universe from each and every charge, right out of nothing at all. This perpetual motion and creation of energy error continues even though particle physics has known, and proven, both theoretically and experimentally, that any charge, as a set of composite dipoles, when the charge is taken with its clustering virtual charges of opposite sign, is a broken symmetry in its fierce energy exchange with the vacuum. Hence the charge extracts that energy in its fields and potentials from the active vacuum, and outputs the extracted energy across space. Our own electrodynamicists and electrical engineering professors and departments would have us believe, and they continue to imply such in every university in America, that every charge is a perpetual motion machine, clearly in violation of the master energy conservation dictum that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The complete lack of scientific understanding that every charge extracts energy from the vacuum and freely and continuously pours it out as real observable electromagnetic energy, is reflected in rather silly witch hunts against electrical systems which exhibit more energy output than the operator himself inputs, i.e., systems which exhibit a coefficient of performance of COP greater than 1, which are open electromagnetic systems far from equilibrium in their active environmental exchange. Let us reason together. If the second law of thermodynamics really did prohibit coefficient of performance greater than 1 electrical systems, then it also would prohibit the demonstrated coefficient of performance equal to infinity of a solar cell array. It would also prohibit the demonstrated coefficient of performance greater than 1 mechanical systems such as a windmill, water wheel, or sailboat, all of which have coefficient of performance equal to infinity. In other words, the second law cannot even be a law if it discriminates only one type of energy prohibited from being used for coefficient of performance greater than 1, for some inexplicable reason. Electromagnetic coefficient of performance greater than 1 systems have come to be dogmatically labeled perpetual motion machines by the professional skeptics, since electromagnetic systems must take their excess energy from the known active vacuum environment. In short, the dogmatic scientific community is saying that windmill-type electromagnetic systems with coefficient of performance equal to infinity are permissible for exchanges with physically active and observable environments, such as the sunlight used in solar cells, the heat in the air used in heat pumps, the water currents used hydroelectric power plants, the winds used in windmill power generation, etc., but they are not permissible for exchanges with the proven modern active vacuum virtual particle flux energy environment, even though the discovery of broken symmetry in 1957 already proves that all electromagnetic energy is indeed freely taken from the seething vacuum environment by the asymmetry of the modern dipolarity of the source charge. We refer the interested reader to the proven broken symmetry of opposite charges. We also refer the reader to Nobelist T. D. Lee's statement applicable to the skeptic's naive notion of symmetry. Finally, in modern physics all the major forces of nature are generated by the exchange of virtual particles. It is these forces that then translate against a resisting mass or entity to provide useful work. So all useful work in the universe already comes from the interactions of the seething virtual flux of the vacuum. On what distant planet have the skeptics been hiding while all this modern physics has been developed? One must keep one's sense of humor. It is ironic but true that every major university in the US continues to teach, uphold, and advocate by implication electromagnetic charges as ubiquitous perpetual motion machines, freely creating energy from nothing. And that is those professional skeptics and witch hunters never mention that their own naive understanding of electrodynamics already implicitly assumes and teaches perpetual motion machines freely creating energy from nothing at all and on a scale unparalleled in scientific history. We have one chart with some 32 major foundations, errors and flaws in the electrodynamics taught in all our schools. There are many others in addition. This erroneous teaching has so indoctrinated our graduate students that most electrical engineers no longer know the real difference between power, the rate of change of form of energy and thus the rate of production of work, and rate of energy flow, whether it is being dissipated or not. Every textbook speaks of sources furnishing power, when it is the rate of dissipation of energy in the individual loads and losses to provide the rate of doing work that constitutes power. Sources do not furnish power. They furnish energy flow. Specifically, their source dipole furnishes energy flow, extracted and transduced directly from the active vacuum, and only a tiny bit of that enormous energy flow is diverged into the circuit and used. The various components of the receiving circuit interact with that energy flow to catch and dissipate a little of it, thus producing power and work locally in the intercepting and dissipating component. A massive non-divergent, non-intercepted, energy flow has zero power, time rate of doing work, but if intercept and diverged, the divergence may develop enormous power, time rate of doing work, in and upon the interceptor, diverger, or collector. Even many physicists today are confused on the difference between rate of work and rate of energy flow. For example, for about 30 years now, there has been a polite debate involving that very subject in the American Journal of Physics. It is still not completely resolved, because the argument has not actually addressed where all energy in fields, potentials, and waves comes from in the first place, directly from the seething vacuum via the asymmetry of the source charge. It also has not addressed the long unaccounted giant heaviside non-diverged energy flow component. Toward a deeper electrodynamics. The first thing the Soviet academicians did after Second World War was to completely overhaul electrodynamics, but in highly classified areas controlled totally by the KGB. Stalin's boot firmly planted on their backside saw to it, creating the terrible fear that if they failed to produce, they would surely die. Not having experienced such a Stalin boot, our own scientific community continues leisurely onward, while it teaches 110 years old electrodynamic material filled with non sequiturs. The Russian use of the information content of the field euphemism is a case in point. Our fellows, in both the intelligence community and the scientific community, assume the Russians are speaking of simple transverse electromagnetic wave spectral analysis. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Let me explain. In 1903, E.T. Whittaker, a leading theoretical physicist at the time, showed that any scalar potential is comprised of a harmonic set of bidirectional longitudinal electromagnetic wave pairs. Each pair consists of a longitudinal electromagnetic wave and its true phase conjugate replica, i.e., its anti-wave, or time-reversed twin, coupled together. Unknown to Whittaker, that longitudinal wave-wave pair actually includes a time-density wave in the time domain, coupled to a longitudinal electromagnetic wave in 3-space. Per quantum field theory, such a coupled pair would be observable as the scalar potential. Knowledge of this specialized coupling is necessary in order to properly decipher the priori mechanism. That mechanism was demonstrated to time reverse, dedifferentiate, a diseased or damaged cell and all its parts back to its previous normal state, genetics and all. The time reversal was accomplished by pumping the cell and all its parts in the time dimension so that time reversal propagation of the mass energy is achieved. The time domain pumping is done by the associated time density wave, which always accompanies any longitudinal electromagnetic wave a priori. So sometimes we sloppily say that the longitudinal electromagnetic wave pumping causes the time reversal of the mass, but it is really the associated time density wave pumping that causes it. The time density wave component also can cause time charging or time excitation charging of a mass. During its alternate existence as mass time, the time portion is altered, and that is a time excitation or time energy excitation. It turns out the human cellular regenerative system also uses the same time excitation charging methodology to produce time pumping of the cell and all its parts. This produces a slow time reversal, dedifferentiation, of damaged cells back to a previous state. This is in fact the basic mechanism for healing, as used by the living body. Reversing aluminum, for example, just converts it back to ordinary aluminum. Not too interesting. Reversing an HIV-infected cell, however, would produce a healthy, normal cell with normal genetics. When a damaged cell turns into a cancerous cell, it is due to a process called promotion, change of the cell to a cancerous cell. Reversing a cancerous cell would change it back to a healthy, normal cell again. In short, it would constitute demotion of cancer and then healing of the damage in the now normal but damaged cell. In the AIDS patient, simply pumping the entire body with the time density wave accompanying the longitudinal electromagnetic waves produced in a plasma as priori did for terminal tumors would time reverse all cells, completely ridding them of any residue of HIV infection. This would remove all the HIV factories, thus completely solving the problem of AIDS. We have also uncovered a more advanced process where matter can essentially be directly engineered in any conceivable manner, including nuclear transmutation, etc. We have filed a provisional patent application and will file formal patent applications on those processes in the future. As soon as funds are available, patent attorneys are expensive. Time is highly compacted energy. Since time is energy compacted by some 9 multiplied by 10 power 16, even small time density changes can produce enormous spatial energy. Should any of that compacted energy be transduced from time density waves into transverse electromagnetic waves and thus into spatial electromagnetic energy. Such transduction can indeed occur in nonlinear materials and processes, such as in electrolysis. The new transduction model explains the cold fusion results and mechanisms. In August 1998, we presented a conference paper pointing out that cold fusion uses this very transduction of electromagnetic wave types, one into the other. We presented such new concepts as 1. Transverse wave to longitudinal wave to time density wave transduction, and in the other direction also, 2. Time density charging of a particle to an excited time density state, analogous to energy charging to an excited energy state, and 3. The observation that excess phase conjugation in a local region can generate a time reversal zone where like charges attract and unlike charges repel. With these concepts we were able to explain the excess heat appearing in the cold fusion experiments of hundreds of researchers. We also came up with 4. A totally new class of nuclear reactions without the usual high energy considerations. That is, we showed the exact nature of the electronuclear reaction that is forming the anomalous nuclides in cold fusion experiments. Production of the new nuclides was revealed to be simply what one would expect from this mechanism, as indeed was particle clustering of like-charged particles. We also explained, v. all the instrumental anomalies occurring in a series of well-documented cold fusion electrolysis experiments at China Lake. In fact, 4. We added a completely new term to the conservation of energy law, thereby extending it. An updated explanation is included in my new book, Energy from the Vacuum, 2002, IBID. With the new transduction interactions, one must state that the total energy in a. spatial energy form, b. mass energy form, and c. time energy form is what is conserved. So when transduction occurs in cold fusion experiments, electrolysis, some of the time density charge energy is gradually transduced into ordinary transverse electromagnetic wave energy, which as it scatters produces excess heat not accounted for in present particle physics interaction models. Scientists with only the old two-term Einstein conservation law in mind, will be firmly convinced that this excess heat represents a violation of conservation of energy, hence is impossible. So they will question the calorimetry ability of the cold fusion scientists, etc. Unfortunately, the more ardent defenders of the orthodox faith will unjustifiably impugn the intentions and morals of the experimenters themselves with vicious ad hominem attacks. Such has indeed been precisely the case. Many of the harsh scientific critics have acted like cur-dogs in a pack attack, and not as scientists at all. Once one analyzes cold fusion in the new three-term conservation manner and with the new transduction concepts, one immediately sees that the overall conservation of energy is upheld, while the special case represented by the former energy conservation law, conservation of the sum of the spatial energy and the mass energy, is permissibly violated. The former case was a special case in that it arbitrarily assumed that no transduction of time energy into spatial energy or mass energy or vice versa occurred. In essence, successful cold fusion experiments show that, via transduction, a bit of time itself can be utilized for fuel and transduced into ordinary electromagnetic energy. Energy-wise, the system has become a nonlinear open dissipative system far from thermodynamic equilibrium. As such, it is permitted to 1. Self-organize, 2. Self-oscillate, 3. Output more energy than it itself has, by merely receiving, converting, and using excess energy from its environment, in this rays, from the transduction of a tiny bit of the time charging that has occurred. 4. Power itself while simultaneously powering a load or performing useful work, and 5. Exhibit negentropy. With the exception of transduction of time charge into excess energy, all of that is already in the thermodynamics texts, though it has not been clearly spelled out in electromagnetics texts. The source charge, for example, exhibits all 5 of those capabilities. The inclusion of time domain as part of the external active environment, however, is an extension of previous open dissipative system work by leading researchers such as Prigozhin. It dramatically extends the meaning of active environment. Why there is a time delay in the onset of cold fusion phenomena. With an energy-to-time compaction ration of 9 multiplied by L0 power 16, energy processes have to transduce spatial energy into time for quite a while in order to build up very much time excitation charge. This leads to an initial delay in the onset of the new law transduction phenomena, as directly shown by the vast majority of careful cold fusion experiments. This build-up occurs during the palladium lattice loading time, for example. By the same token, there is a time delay after cutoff of the input power to such experiments, during which time the slowly decaying time density charge by its transduction into spatial energy continues to maintain the anomalous new processes, such as excess heat production, as they slowly subside. So the hours-long or even days-long delay phenomena after input power shutdown are also explained by the new approach. In summary, there exists some very anomalous but very good experiments by excellent scientists, more than 600 of them, that are at least totally consistent with the above new wave polarization transduction model. Consistency with experiments is the first element of proof. It is necessary, but by itself it is not sufficient. The new model also contains and obeys the conventional conservation of energy law until the new transduction phenomena become observable, at which time the extended energy conservation law applies. So in its lower limit, the new model corresponds to the present model again, another requirement of any model purporting to extend a scientific area past that area's conventional model description. The KGB weapons scientists, not the regular Russian academic establishment, have about a 40-year lead on us in all these areas. While our own scientists have dallied and pursued the standard model, the Russian weapon scientists have produced the equivalent of 10 Manhattan projects, back-to-back, in the new energetics area. The early Soviet longitudinal wave interferometers. Using longitudinal electromagnetic waves, the early KGB energetics interferometers could pass their beams right through the earth and ocean. Longitudinal waves readily penetrate matter, reacting with it only weakly. Some longitudinal wave interferometry was also done using ordinary electromagnetic waves as carriers for the longitudinal wave functions. Each such transverse wave carrier is in fact 2 scalar potential functions, Whittaker 1904, the initiation of superpotential theory. In each scalar potential for which functions are extracted and used to make the normal transverse carrier wave, there exist longitudinal wave-by-wave pairs comprising said potential. So by assembling the desired longitudinal wave-by-wave subsets, the 2 scalar potentials and their resulting interference-produced carrier wave are internally structured as desired. This is the use of the so-called internal information content of the field. We speak of such a deliberately structured potential, field, or wave as having been conditioned, dimensioned, or activated. If these terms are deemed inappropriate, just use the more generic term internally structured. Then one has to explain what the internal is, and how this internal can be structured. In the distant interferometry zone, those dimensioned potentials, fields, or carrier waves would interfere and produce the desired alterations in the local spacetime, including specific spacetime curvature engines. Remember, the potentials are just bundles of special waves. We are discussing a special form of nonlinear multi-wave interferometry, where the individual waves and waveforms comprising the total wave package assembly constituting a carrier have been carefully chosen in advance. In the local spacetime in the distant interference zone, such multi-wave longitudinal electromagnetic wave pair interferometry creates ordinary electromagnetic waves and energy that arise directly from each and every point in that individual interference zone. We stress that ordinary transverse wave electromagnetic energy propagation through the intervening space between the interferometer transmitters and the distant target does not occur. In January 1960, in a speech to the Presidium, "Those are the weapons then in final engineering development for production that Khrushchev spoke of as fantastic new weapons." Khrushchev killed the Thresher to prevent his own dismissal. The first deployed large force structure interferometer weapons became operational circa April 1, 1963. Khrushchev was still smarting from his Cuban Missile Crisis fiasco and his humiliation by Kennedy. Having overplayed his hand and gotten caught, Khrushchev was desperate to stay in power and not be thrown out by the Communist Party leaders for such a massive loss of face. On April 10 of 1963, Khrushchev used his new interferometers to reach through the earth and ocean and kindle electromagnetic jamming in the electrical controls of the USS Thresher nuclear submarine underwater off the east coast of the U.S. The reader should recall that, wherever the interference zone is established, including in the earth or underneath the ocean, in the atmosphere, or in space, the energy arises directly out of the local space-time. There is no Faraday shielding off such effects, which do not depend upon ordinary transverse wave electromagnetic field energy propagation through space. The energy appears everywhere within the targeted object, simultaneously. It is extremely important that the reader recognize the dramatic difference in the way energy propagates in the new mode as compared to the old propagation through space mode. In the old mode, energy transport arises in one spatial location and is considered to proceed serially through the intervening spatial points to the intercepting and interacting particles location. The Poynting model presently uses only this mode. In other words, the energy propagates from without the object to the object, and thence inward inside the object, if possible as the object interacts. On the other hand, when the energy arises at each and every point in spacetime, it then propagates outward from each arising point. Thus in the nucleus of an atom, the energy flow starts at all interior spatial points and flows or diffuses outward in all directions. So the energy meets and interacts with the quarks in the nucleons, before it meets the nucleon as a whole and translates it. For this reason, with energetics it is easier to alter and flip quarks in nucleons than it is to translate nucleons, since one is using the new energy propagation mode. This simple reversal of the outside to inside energy propagation to an inside to outside mode, is a revolution in particle physics and effects on materials. In fact, the energy dramatically enters the interior areas of nuclei, nucleons, etc. in a manner heretofore impossible or extremely difficult to achieve by high-energy physics, which können Leute bis Maschinen the object with sheer brute kinetic energy. Therefore the new inside-to-outside energy propagation mode can produce at feeble spatial energy extraordinary nuclear interactions not possible by brute force outside-to-inside energy propagation means. By controlling the structuring oft-arising oft-energy atic point in space-time, the energy structure interacting with the quarks and other interior components can be tailored to order. This is the primary secret of transmuting an element at a distance by a specialized energetics weapon. The structuring of the emerging internal energy can be deliberately tailored to change quarks in, say, some of the nucleons of uranium-235 and plutonium nuclei. In this fashion nuclear warheads, nuclear power plants, and nuclear propulsion systems of atomic submarines can be altered at a distance, beneath the Earth's surface, beneath the ocean's surface, in space above the Earth, etc. The electromagnetic hash emerging from the Russian interferometry simply jammed the electrical controls and systems of the thresher from inside its very electrical circuits. Out of control and helpless, the thresher sank to crush depth and imploded. The electromagnetic splatter from that interferometry, arising from the local space-time throughout a surrounding region, engulfed the Skylark, the surface companion of the thresher. The resulting spurious electromagnetic jamming severely interfered with multiple electronic systems on the Skylark. Several electronic systems just ceased working altogether. Their electrical forces were time energy excited and time reversed so that electron currents in them became impossible, blocked. It required over an hour for the Skylark to transmit an emergency message back to the Navy that the sub was in difficulty, through all that interferometry jamming effects. The Russians undoubtedly tracked the sub till it imploded, then cut off the interferometry. As the time density charging in the area slowly diminished, all failed electronic systems in the Skylark returned to full functioning. This was because the excess time energy excitation just decayed away, so that electrical currents could again flow. Khrushchev demonstrated the powerful blast capability of strategic interferometry the next day, 100 miles north of Puerto Rico, the same KGB interferometer weapon was powerfully pulsed to produce a giant M-burst deep under the ocean's surface. A cone of water rose up from the surface to about a half-mile in height, observed by the startled crew of a passing U.S. jetliner and reported to the FBI and Coast Guard when the aircraft landed in Florida. As it rose, the cone of water spread into a cauliflower shape typical of a deep underwater nuclear burst that does not vent the gas bubble. Then that giant cauliflower of water fell back out of the sky and into the ocean. The second successful demonstration of Khrushchev's scalar interferometer weapon had been made for the benefit of the Presidium and the leaders of the Communist Party. With those two dramatic tests, Khrushchev had killed the latest and greatest U.S. atomic submarine and demonstrated the awesome power of energetics weapons. He had shown the leaders of the Communist Party that the U.S. had no inkling of his new superweapons. He had struck the U.S. a formidable blow in a direct act of war, but a new kind of clandestine energetics war, and gotten clean away with it. Now it was Kennedy, rather than Khrushchev, who had been duped. So had the entire U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. scientific community. Sadly, mostly they apparently remain duped or partially duped to this day. Khrushchev managed to stay in power nearly 2 years longer by these two demonstrations. So the KGB Soviets embarked on a decades-long program of build-up and development of the new weaponry, clandestinely, in order to take the US by surprise attack and destroy it utterly. In 1972, Brezhnev named 1985 as the target year when Russia would be able to do as it pleased, and would essentially control the land, the oceans, and space. This was stated at a secret meeting of the European Communist parties in Europe. A British intelligence agent was in the meeting, and furnished the US that information. Later it was openly released and published. The Russians met that 1985 deadline, and the resulting increase in killing US missiles and aircraft in 1985 to 1986 was most indicative. Other indicators such as massive weather engineering were already ongoing. Weather engineering over North America. The first KGB weather engineering tests over the US, using their relatively new interferometers, produced signatures of anomalous perfectly round holes appearing in clouds. These experiments started in 1967 or thereabouts. The Russians gave us that very severe deep freeze winter of 1967, as an initial weather engineering test of their energetics interferometry weapons. The KGB communists do have a sense of historical dates, and they often do things on certain dates in symbolic fashion. Full-time Soviet weather engineering over North America started in earnest on July 4, 1976, our Independence Day and our bicentennial. This was the KGB's gift to the United States on such a historic occasion. Full-bore weather engineering over the Americas has continued to this day, and even increased. It was passed into the hands of the Yakuza and the Aum Shinrikyo upon their leasing of those interferometers on site in Russia at the end of 1989. In 1985 I produced a rather crude videotape, 40 minutes, with pictures of the giant radial cloud signatures etc. associated with such weather engineering operations since 1976. The basic weather engineering method is simple. Use an LW interferometer, longitudinal wave interferometer, to reach through the earth and cool the air in a region and produce a high pressure area, due to the densification of the air. Use another interferometer to heat another area and form a low pressure area, due to the expansion of the air. Then carefully steer those highs and lows by gradually and slowing rotating the distant antennae and slowly adjusting the interferometry range simultaneously, according to a calculated schedule. By that means, the longitudinal wave interferometers easily catch, entrain, and steer the jet streams largely responsible for our weather. Put sharp loops and twists in that steering, and the huge angular momentum of the jet streams developed in those sharp turns and circles will spawn tornadoes, violent weather, etc. The first complete weather engineering system over North America in 1976 also used the woodpecker's normal M carrier signals with dimensioning and internal assemblage of the composite longitudinal electromagnetic wave pairs. A giant interference grid was established over much of North America. A great deal of local adjusting of the interferometry in the grid was necessary. These local grid readjustments caused sudden pop-outs of electromagnetic energy, creating many atmospheric booms, rumbles, and explosions. To really stir up big weather trouble, the Russians and now the Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo also heat or cool areas of the ocean where El Niño and similar water engines form. A dimensioned longitudinal wave interferometer is required for this operation. By slowly and protractedly heating or cooling the water in one of the warm water engines fueling the weather, one causes a very significant, long-term, later effect on perhaps an entire continent. One can create great droughts in some areas, great floods in others, etc. The KGB has been doing this extensively, since 1976. The great floods in Red China a few years ago are a direct example of KGB Yakuza weather engineering, as is much of the extreme heat of 1998. In fact, thanks to the weather operations of the Yakuza under their KGB mentors, 1998 was the overall hottest year on record till then, since records were kept. At least for the summer of 2002, the record may have been broken again, with a significant season of giant forest fires burning away. One purpose of the excess heating of the atmosphere, of course, is to do damage. An added benefit to the KGB is to furnish support to the environmentalists who are concerned about global warming. Understand, there is indeed such a thing as global warming. But by augmenting the atmospheric, and ice sheet, heating just a bit in a single year, the statistical analyses are skewed. The skewed analyses will show that the global warming problem is far more imminent than it really is, if the longitudinal wave interferometer engineering of it were suspended. Nobody on either side of the global warming debate seems aware of the longitudinal wave interferometer intervention that is ruining the results of their models and calculations. In turn, the heightened global warming indications, detected as a result of the longitudinal wave interferometer interruptions, impel strong activist support for such things as the Kyoto Treaty, which is specifically designed to the strategic detriment of US if and when the US Senate ever approves it. The Kyoto Treaty does not even apply to some 160 countries including Russia, China, etc. This focuses a certain proportion of our government time and effort in grappling with an inflated global warming problem, immediately. It directly fits the KGB strategy of spreading our government energy and attention all over the map, anywhere but upon the coming strategic energetics strike and upon energetics weaponry. The die-hard section of the KGB strategists are chess players. They will come at you anyway, anyhow, and anywhen that they can. Everything that can be impressed to serve or support the overall objective, will be impressed and used. That is the overriding principle when analyzing Russian KGB strategy. Khrushchev meant every word of it when he said to Nixon in their famous kitchen debate, "We will bury you." Interestingly, to this day Americans and their government officials have continued to be deceived as to exactly what Khrushchev meant. He meant it literally. Earthquakes to order. According to U.S. Defense Secretary Cohen, electromagnetic induction of earthquakes is now recognized by the U.S. Department of Defense, considering his little notice statement in Georgia in 1997, which we previously quoted. An interesting exchange of induced earthquakes had occurred in latter 1988 and early 1989. Here two sides seemed to be counting rifles. As Secretary Cohen made his April 1997 statement obliquely recognizing the scalar interferometer weapons, the little friendly nation had just completed countering and averting a massive strategic energetic strike upon the United States and Western Europe, scheduled for May 1, 1997, just 3 days later. A little more than 2 months earlier, a previously scheduled attack had also been countered and averted by the same friendly little nation. Once one can reach into or through the earth and ocean and create energy in a desired interference zone, induction of earthquakes is simple. Use the interferometers to deposit energy in a fault zone over a period of time. Keep it up, and the piezoelectric plates build up enough mechanical stress to forcibly slip and produce an earthquake. Put the energy in very slowly, and one gets a long over potential effect where the rocks do not slip for a long time, while the energy builds to higher levels due to the static friction of the rocks. Then there occurs a rather rapid catastrophic slip. In short, one produces a large destructive earthquake. The KGB weaponry can produce earthquakes of the highest magnitude if they work at it. If one wishes to induce a quake in an area where there are no known faults, then one simply focuses the interference zone there inside the solid rocks and proceeds to deposit the energy, preferably rather quickly, in hours instead of days. The entire rock will be expanded and it will fracture, producing an anomalous so-called flat plate earthquake. Around the early 1900s, the normal rate of large earthquakes was 2 or 3 per year. That gradually increased after Second World War. During 1 week in year 2000, there were some 20 major earthquakes around the globe. Obviously, someone is doing it, since this is far beyond what could be expected naturally. Presently that someone is mostly the Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo, on site in Russia and leasing the longitudinal wave interferometers. With the scheduled causal system robot attacks forcibly aborted, the KGB has the problem of restraining an increasingly impatient Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo group, while keeping them paying the lucrative lease money. Consequently, inducing some big earthquakes is one way to keep the troops occupied and busy. Shooting down the occasional aircraft or missile is another way. I worked for 8 years or more with an inventor, Floyd Sweet, now deceased, who had an energy device sensitive to artificially induced quakes of that fashion, even such quakes thousands of miles away. The device would sit right on top of a normal quake and not react. We could tell within some 8 to 10,000 miles and often even for greater distances which quakes were artificial and which were natural. So during that period I was able to clearly ascertain what was going on, and who was doing what to whom, and which quakes were normal and which were man-made. Several artificial US quakes, the Armenia quake, and a subsequent big quake in Russia were particularly interesting in the mid and latter 1980s. The huge 1976 China quake was directly induced by the KGB. Brewer briefs President Reagan on Soviet scalar M weapons October 1984, then briefs National Security Council. In 1984, on my behalf Roy Brewer had briefed President Reagan on these scalar interferometry weapons, then briefed the National Security Council. Let us hope that these high-level briefings may have borne at least some fruit. Readying the weapons for the 1985 readiness demonstration tests. In latter April 1985 I received an urgent call from my close colleague Frank Golden. In his avionics repair work, he suddenly found that his best calibration instruments were very noisy. He replaced one expensive instrument, and the second was noisy, also. A third proved equally noisy. This was unparalleled. It was not the instruments, but instead it was all the electronics to be repaired, that were emitting electromagnetic noise. So Frank borrowed one expensive instrument and brought it home for the weekend. He altered it by a proprietary method so that he could detect energetics radiation. Voila! The entire Earth was alive with Soviet energetics signals. The weak interferometry of so many signals impinging into the weakly interacting electronic systems to be repaired, had generated the electronic noise his instruments had detected. In response to Frank's call, I immediately proceeded to his location. I personally observed on the oscilloscope, as detected by Golden, some pairs of Russian energetics signals, each of the two in a pair being 12 kHz apart. We have previously explained why two frequencies are used, and one pretends one transmitted the difference frequency. Each of these frequency pairs represented the entire Earth held in entrained resonance. Each pair was an energy tap in the Earth, extracting enormous energy from the heat of the molten core of the Earth itself and outputting it as 12 kHz power for transmission to giant interferometry weapon sites. Each tap was extracting energy sufficient to power perhaps 4 to 6 of the giant intercontinental energetics interferometer weapons. We were observing something like 100 to 150 massive weapons online and radiating. A full-up strategic dress rehearsal or preparations for a full-up strategic attack on the US was underway. Gorbachev was still a new man on the job at that time. Further, 1985 was the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II, and a very important occasion for the communists and in fact for all Russians. The May Day celebrations that year went on for several days, not just on May 1st. What we were seeing were preparations for a massive May Day weaponry demonstration in and around May 1st, 1985. We were observing the preparation and demonstrated readiness of all that great armada of Soviet energetics weapons, to meet Brezhnev's 1985 schedule laid down back in 1972. Longitudinal electromagnetic wave communications to deep underwater Soviet subs, the huge interferometer armada, and everything else all were being readied and demonstrated. I can assure the reader that observing full rehearsal of preparations for the next World War was a most sobering experience. After May 1st, most of the armada of interferometers was stood down again because it had been demonstrated that the ready schedule had been met. All but one of the giant energy taps in the Earth were also stood down again. That one remained active. The May Day report to the heads of the Communist Party that year must have really been something. As usual, apparently our own scientific and intelligence communities did not detect the main activities, and would not have believed it if one told them. They certainly did not believe it when I published it in 1986 in Fer de Lance, but labeled it sheer fantasy or at best total conjecture. It was neither fantasy nor conjecture. It was direct experimental measurement. It was in fact what used to be called scientific method. The problem with our intelligence agencies was that they operated behind policies. Once the policy is decided, then regardless of what the intelligence analysis indicates, anything against the official policy is just ignored. This neat little policy method of doing business has resulted in making our intelligence agencies some of the most political-minded and manipulative groups on Earth. Meeting the 1985 schedule for readiness. In 1985, KGB Russian preparations began in earnest for the energetics weapons readiness projected for that year by Brezhnev in 1972. Being full-bore tests, these actually went after destruction of vehicles and killing people. These were actual acts of war. The so-called Cold War was not nearly so cold as pictured in the news media. Early that year, and longitudinal wave interferometers was used to cool the combustion in the engines of a jetliner off the coast of San Francisco, bound for Los Angeles. This flamed out the engines. The stricken craft fell 30,000 feet before the time-density cooling charge drained away, sufficient for the pilot to restart his engines and limp into San Francisco. Gravitational and inertial anomalies, a clear signature of the use of this electromagnetic general relativity weapon, were exhibited upon the personnel in the cockpit. The official investigators ignored those signatures, After all, such is not in their standard check sheets. And everybody knows the standard checklists are already perfect. 6-mile drop in 2 minutes. China Airlines Flight 006 Taipei to Los Angeles February 19, 1985. 41,000 feet upper level, through turbulent pocket. Interferometric cooling of combustion gases in engines. One engine fails, others reduce then fail. Differing gravity forces experienced anomalously by pilot and co-pilot. Impossible without unknown force also acting. 11,000 feet engine restart. 9,000 feet recovery. Extinguishing combustion in the engines of a jetliner February 19, 1985. KGB crews regularly practiced against U.S. rocket launches from Cape Canaveral. In a late November 1985 night shuttle launch at Cape Canaveral, the Russian interferometer crews continued their practice of using the U.S. shuttle launches as convenient simulated intercontinental ballistic missile launches, for energetics interferometer crew practice. Electromagnetic missiles, balls of electromagnetic energy formed in the area by distant longitudinal wave interferometry through the Earth, were used as the destructive agent, but were offset from the actual launch in order not to destroy the shuttle. This was normal crew drill, not combat operations. The practice range for energetics weapons is, as might be expected, the actual targeted area and targeted nation itself. As shown in Fer de Lance, I published an actual picture of such a KGB electromagnetic missile strike, offset from that shuttle launch in late November 1985 and snapped by Bob Gladwin. I also published an actual picture of a second such electromagnetic ball of glowing energy, over the launch site for the same launch, and used as a registration point. The longitudinal waves deviate slightly in passage through the Earth, since the potentials in the Earth are not constant. George Sacheri took the second photo. A standard artillery shift from known registration point method of firing was being used. In other words, the crews establish longitudinal wave track on that electromagnetic registration ball, right through the Earth. That represents a point having a known set of coordinates, a registration point established in the firing computer. Then when the targeted strategic missile, in this case the shuttle's main booster, ignites, the interferometer also tracks the huge ionization target of the exhaust with the same weapon system. That gives a known relative location of the missile rear end, with respect to one's registration settings for the registration point ball of light. Then add some meters to move up onto the missile body proper, and voila! The center of the target missile that will be fired is now in the bullseye, so to speak. That is a standard shift from a known registration point method of shooting, well known to every artillery group on the planet. The marker beacon is what is known as a high burst registration, except it is not a burst but a steady ball of energy maintained over the area as the registration point. The distant rocket or missile can now be destroyed in a variety of ways. 1. Just create a sudden electromagnetic surge arising right in that space-time, that is, just pulse the interferometer. That burns out some of the inner electronics of the missile, causing partial or complete missile failure. 2. Sharply pulse the interferometer to introduce electromagnetic energy surges and sparks in the fuel or solid propulsion, igniting it massively and blowing up the rocket. Works well for aircraft fuel tanks as well. 3. Form another electromagnetic missile and hit the missile broadside with that, burning through it and destroying it immediately. 4. Hit it with an explosive electromagnetic missile internally, instantly exploding the missile into pieces. Or, 5. Hit it with several of the above simultaneously. Sacheri and Gladwin had captured the direct evidence of KGB dress rehearsal for the strike and kill of the Aero DC-8 in Gander, Newfoundland about 2 weeks later. Kill of the Aero DC, practice turned into performance. 2 weeks later, the same KGB weapon tested against the Cape Canaveral shuttle launch was used to destroy the Aero DC-8 at Gander, Newfoundland, killing some 256 occupants, 248 of them being U.S. soldiers returning from peacekeeping operations overseas. The aircraft was not iced up, later that was clearly established. As the ill-fated Aero aircraft began its thrust down the runway for takeoff, it was already under longitudinal wave interferometer track. The exhausts of the engines were being precisely tracked by distant KGB operators. The KGB operators simply began to cool the combustion gases in the engine combustion chambers, as had been done to a U.S. jetliner earlier that same year off the coast of San Francisco. There they had completely flamed out the engines. Now they did not want to flame out the engines during takeoff, but just wanted to reduce the thrust of those engines. So the available thrust of the engines began decreasing as the aircraft picked up speed on the runway toward takeoff, even though the turbines were rotating at full speed. For powered flight, it is the thrust per drag ratio that is important. One can reduce that ratio by ice loading and therefore increasing the overall aircraft drag, as all Transportation Safety Board check sheets assume if the engines are at full rotation and if operation and icing conditions are present. Or one can reduce the ratio by reducing the engine thrust itself, as was done for the Aero, even though the plane is de-iced. All the Transportation Safety Board check sheets assume that it has to be drag increase, and thus due to icing. The National Transportation Safety Board investigators know nothing about longitudinal electromagnetic wave interferometry and its capabilities and its development by several nations of the world. Neither do their check sheets. Sadly, the National Transportation Safety Board is not even aware that the electrodynamics and electrical engineering it assumes is so perfect is in fact a decrepit old model based on century-old errors. They are unaware that much better electrodynamics models have long been developed for particle physics, because the crusty old classical model is totally inadequate. Their check sheets also are unaware of anything really modern, such as electrodynamics models of the higher group symmetry kind. The thrust reduction by combustion gas cooling does not appear on the official check sheets and is never considered. It is not considered to this day. It will probably still not be considered this century. Observers on the ground heard those engines laboring, which can be a direct symptom of combustion gas cooling and engine thrust reduction. Rough running and missing can be another, if the cooling increases. Engine flameout occurs when the combustion no longer can be sustained because of the dramatically lowered temperature of the gases. The Aero pilot sensed the lack of power, but the aircraft was immediately hit. At rotation and liftoff, the pilot of the Aero DC-8 immediately sensed his lack of lift, and started a slow turn to the right, apparently intending to come around and land again as an emergency measure. Meanwhile, crossed beams had formed in the sky above and off to the right side. From those crossed beams of light, there shot down a bright streak of light that struck the fuselage of the aircraft in the right side, ahead of the engines. That was the electromagnetic missile strike, just as had been offset from the shuttle launch 2 weeks earlier in Florida, and photographed by Bob Gladwin. That piece of Aero DC-8 fuselage hit by the electromagnetic missile, with a burned hole in it, was recovered and tested. Tests showed no explosive residues on the edges of the hole, so it was not made by a bomb or other explosive device. Instead, it was made by an electromagnetic missile of the type that over a decade later hit the TWA-800 several times off Long Island and killed it. In the Aero aircraft's kill, the fiery electromagnetic missile sharply ignited the plastics in the forward cabin, which explosively outgassed. One product of such outgassing is hydrogen cyanide. A whiff or two, and all the passengers in that section were already dying of cyanide poisoning. In the autopsies of the recovered bodies, about half the passengers were already dead of cyanide poisoning before the plane impacted the ground and exploded. They died while that aircraft was still flying and sinking tail first toward the ground. The results of those autopsies were deliberately withheld from the Canadian Investigative Board. The impact of the electromagnetic missile on the Aero DC-8 was clearly recorded by sharp, vertical electromagnetic surges, spikes, in traces on both data recorders on board the aircraft. In Gravitobiology, on page 82 I printed the recorded sensor responses for that signature also. Elements of the U.S. government deliberately suppressed vital evidence. Several eyewitnesses, including Judy Parsons, physically observed the formation of the crossed beams in the sky. Parsons and perhaps others actually saw the streak down and strike of the electromagnetic missile when it hit the doomed Aero DC-8. Parsons tried to testify, but her testimony was never allowed to be heard by the Canadian Transportation Safety Board. A major U.S. news agency interviewed her, but then squelched the story for some unknown reason. Other witnesses, who are still reluctant to come forward, did observe the strike of the electromagnetic missile also. Why would the U.S. government deliberately suppress information relating to the cause of the deaths of 248 of our soldiers returning from peacekeeping missions overseas? Why were they so determined that this direct act of war be declared an accident in the face of overwhelming evidence that it was not an accident at all? Iran-Contra was not yet divulged at the time. Recall, at very high level our own fellows had directly violated the law, and were engaged in the illegal Iran-Contra fiasco up to their eyeballs. Also, some officials in Washington in certain high U.S. government circles were in near panic, in their personal, erroneous, firm belief that a Middle East-sponsored terrorist bomb had destroyed the Aero. In that case, so they reasoned, with the murder of 248 of our soldiers, the American public would be so aroused and angry that they would force military action against the Middle East nation or group, and that would then reveal Iran-Contra. Too many highly placed people's hands were dirty. So extreme spin control was the major requirement. Damn how many American soildares had just been killed in an overt act of war against the U.S. Damn the implications of the use of eerie new weapons we did not possess. A hue and cry from the U.S. public would almost certainly reveal Iran-Contra and smoke out the Dooley secrets. That must not happen at any cost. Some high officials, particularly the ones who engage in such illegal acts, in assassinations, murders, etc., are far more interested in covering up their nefarious deeds than they are interested in any kind of justice or morality. Consequently, the fix was in. So U.S. officials placed enormous pressure on Canada to produce a finding of icing. Lots of other skullduggery occurred, which probably constituted criminal activity by some U.S. officials. A high-ranking U.S. military officer arrived on site quickly, apparently under orders to erase that scene as fast as possible. He almost immediately wanted the Canadians to bulldoze over the site, even before recovery operations were complete and while the investigation was just getting underway. The site was bulldozed over in unseemly haste not long thereafter. That would appear to possibly constitute deliberate tampering with the evidence at an official site of investigation, on the part of whoever ordered the general to bulldoze the site precipitously. In addition, witnesses such as Parsons were never allowed to testify. The Canadian board waited until the half of its members who strongly opposed any ad hoc finding were absent, and hastily approved a finding of icing as the cause of the accident. Later the disgruntled board members who were absent when the voting occurred, issued their own minority report. Unfortunately they knew nothing of scalar interferometry and energetics weapons, and so they strongly believed it had to be sabotage and explosives. Anyway, the blackguards hiding Iran-Contra buried the incident, and the savage kill of 248 of our soldiers and 8 civilians went unpunished. Anyone such as the present author who pointed out what had really happened and why, was just branded a lunatic. After all, the blackguards who do not flinch at murder and unapproved assassination do not blink an eye at slander and libel. The sad part is those fine young soldiers and the 8 civilians who were killed, and the grief and lasting changes made to their families. It is the children who had to grow up without their fathers, the mothers whose husbands were suddenly dead, etc. They deserved much better from their government than they got. Other direct energetic signatures on the Aero DC-8 meanwhile, in the lifting DC-8 the strike of the electromagnetic missile had also time density charged the forward cabin materials. Those materials slowly decayed from their excited states via longitudinal electromagnetic wave emission. When a human body is subjected to fairly significant longitudinal waves, accompanied with their time density waves, it gets its internal immune system and cellular regeneration system jammed, since these systems use longitudinal waves and accompanying time density waves. The cells and tissues are also time energy charged as well, and so spurious longitudinal waves continued to be slowly emitted in their tissues and cells locally, leading to gradual, general debilitation. After a time delay for the effects of this time-charged decay to be exhibited, such exposed persons will get sick with odd symptoms of various diseases such as influenza. The ground handlers on the scene and exposed to the struck materials of the aircraft, were also exposed to longitudinal electromagnetic wave radiation from those materials which had been instantly time-charged at the powerful strike. Hence they were exposed to fairly significant longitudinal waves, and should therefore have shown later symptomology. Some 60 or so of the ground handlers actually retrieving the crash materials later sickened with all sorts of mysterious maladies, dizziness, stomach cramps, flu-like symptoms, weakness, nausea, fatigue, etc. Precisely what would be expected if some of the materials they were handling were emitting longitudinal electromagnetic radiation, exposing them to significant longitudinal wave radiation. That is a clear signature again of a strike by an electromagnetic missile, and the exposure of those retrievers to longitudinal wave emissions. In no normal way could 60 off-hose ground crewmen handling the wreckage debris all come down simultaneously with the exact symptoms of longitudinal wave radiation sickness, unless that was what it actually was. Many of those sickened persons remained debilitated for years. Probably a few are still alive and debilitated. There are other signatures on the Aero DC-8 kill. I did a small bit of work on the problem in the interests of Aero Airlines, but of course the conventional investigators they also hired could only conceive of an ordinary explosive. Nevertheless, I did tell them as best I could what happened to their aircraft, their crew members, and our own valiant soldiers. Our troops on board the tragic Aero DC-8 did not die from a simple over-iced plane that crashed as a result of carelessness in de-icing operations. They died as the result of an active war against the US, carried out by the KGB as a test in an entire series to demonstrate the 1985 readiness that Brezhnev had specified in 1972. That war is still partially ongoing and undeclared to this very day, with other players such as the Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo also now in the game and possibly even the Chinese, who certainly have had the weapons for some time, and have had quantum potential weapons and negative energy electromagnetic pulse weapons since earlier this year, 2002. With the kill of the Aero DC-8, the KGB made its deadline that had been set down 13 years earlier by Brezhnev. To meet the 1985 schedule, something significant had to be killed successfully and clandestinely, no later than December 31, 1985. The KGB made the schedule on December 12, 1985, by killing the Aero DC-8 after a warm-up and full dress rehearsal against a U.S. night shuttle launch at Cape Canaveral about 2 weeks earlier. And they also demonstrated just how ignorant of such energetics weapons and their usage the U.S. government, scientific community, and investigative boards really were. We were fortunate they did not just go ahead and kill that same shuttle in late November 1985. Instead, they waited and killed the Challenger a few months later. Other acts of war completed the milestone. Apparently the final demonstration of milestone completion called for the destruction of an aircraft, kill of an intercontinental ballistic missile, kill of a space shuttle, induction of earthquakes, and demonstration of the new quantum potential weapon still in the advanced laboratory stage. The KGB completed much of the milestone demonstration in 1985. The remainder they completed in 1986. In January 1986 they killed the Space Shuttle Challenger, and the very next night the KGB even gave a big party in Moscow, to celebrate the perfect success of their active measures against the shuttle. General Daniel O'Connor, former head of U.S. Army Intelligence, personally issued an alert to many high-ranking U.S. government officials, pointing out the almost certain involvement of the KGB and the fact that the loss of the shuttle was almost certainly due to a hostile act by the Soviets. In April 1986, May Day report time was coming. The KGB killed a Titan intercontinental ballistic missile fired from Vandenberg Air Force Base. They also induced several large earthquakes for practice, and then began the induction of the long-dreaded giant California quake in the San Andreas Fault Zone. This latter induction of what would have been a massive quake in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, and all along the San Andreas Fault, was countered, destroyed, by a civilian group known to this author, with a backlash that resulted in the Chernobyl incident. In April 1986, for the same May Day report, the KGB also demonstrated the effectiveness of their newly emerging quantum potential weapon against the convenient U.S. air attack on Libya. Kill of the Titan missile over Vandenberg Air Force Base in 1986, the KGB began gingerly using those energetics interferometry weapons to kill other U.S. aircraft and several U.S. missiles, including killing a Titan 34D fired from Vandenberg AFB on April 18, 1986. The Titan was killed 9 seconds after launch, partially crippling the U.S. space surveillance program. That kill was part of the demonstration of readiness milestone completion. There was a completely decisive signature on the kill of the Titan. Simply check Aviation Weekend Space Technology, 124, 17, April 28, 1986, page 18, where a picture, the one taken from longer range, of the Titan explosion is printed. Look about an inch above that explosion, which is already well developed. There above the Titan explosion sits the KGB ball of light registration point, just as it was sitting over the night shuttle launch in Cape Canaveral in latter November 1985 when videotaped by a private photographer. I persuaded NBC engineer Ron Cole and his colleagues to analyze a copy of that videotape frame by frame. In 17 frames, that little ball of energy above the explosion moved off on its own course, independent of the Titan explosion. Since the launch area for such missile launches is controlled and there were no aircraft over the explosion, then one again has a very clear signature. The KGB killed the Titan, with 100% certainty. That of course was a test of the interferometry weapons in the role of launch phase ABM system. Tested against the Arrow, the KGB operators were emulating test of the system in a launch phase anti-bomber role. These were vital strategic weapon tests. I published details of the use of the weapons in many other roles. Dead man fusing and outside assistance deterred a full strategic attack in 1986. We have previously documented and published why the US was not fully attacked and destroyed by the Soviets in 1986. It was because of our nuclear facilities, warheads, etc., which would have exploded, creating great fallout hazards worldwide, and because of nuclear dead man fusing weapons clandestinely placed in Russia by one or more other nations. A friendly small nation possessing energetics weapons also intervened directly in L986, and blew up several Russian missile ammunition storage sites, some 5 or so in 6 months. In one such explosion, about 1/3 of all the missiles in the Russian Northern Fleet were destroyed. As we stated, the so-called Cold War was not nearly so cold as has been represented. In short, the friendly little nation served notice on the Soviets that, if they moved against the West, the Soviet Union itself would suffer terribly. They put it in language clearly understood by the KGB. So any full-up strategic attack for that period was stalemated by that combination of factors. A major concern for the Soviets was their inability to counter the dead man fusing problem posed by nuclear weapons clandestinely hidden inside Russia and by the nuclear warheads and reactors inside the targeted nation's. They already had the quantum potential, QP, answer theoretically, and had conducted a demonstration test of a laboratory quantum potential device, but they had not yet completed the quantum potential weapon systems and deployed them. Nonetheless, a very powerful strike of peculiar nature induction of a giant earthquake in the San Andreas Fault Zone, including in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, was scheduled. This strike would have caused billions of dollars worth of damage and would have killed perhaps 200,000 Americans. The initiation of the strike was actually begun in April 1986. As the reader can begin to see, there was to be one Hiluva May Day report in 1986. Incredibly, a private group here in the US then made a unique and unprecedented contribution that saved the day for Los Angeles and San Francisco. What really happened in the Chernobyl disaster using thin side of the woodpecker beams as superhighways for their longitudinal waves and interferometry? In April 1986 the KGB interferometers had started their build-up of substantial induced electromagnetic energy in the sides of the San Andreas Fault that runs through Los Angeles and up through San Francisco. Two beams were being used by the Soviets. One was coming down on the target from the north, coming over the North Pole regions and the ice caps, and one was coming around from the east and upon the target area. Completely, 100%, certain signatures were present, including some ELF chugger waves symptomatic of the Soviet method of inducing very large quakes. The time energy is being used, hence very low frequency ELF is employed to maximize the amount of time energy available for transduction in the rocks on the side of the fault. The Soviets were building up a very large earthquake indeed, to spawn a whole series of such quakes all along the San Andreas Fault with severe aftershocks following after the main quake had done terrible damage. In short, they were preparing to hit California with the big one that everybody had been anticipating and dreading for so long. A private group contacted me. They stated they could take out one of the transmitters by producing a powerful, giant, phase conjugate replica signal pulse upon it that would backtrack right into the transmitter and catastrophically burn it out. A surface application of the phase conjugate shooting once considered for armed satellites that could shoot down rising hostile intercontinental ballistic missiles at 10,000 miles distance. As I understood it, they had a new kind of essentially noise-free regenerative amplifier, used in a transmitter. This meant that extreme amplification could be achieved in a pulse response to a received woodpecker signal, before the transmitter burned out. Since the group had no knowledge of the exact KGB transmitter locations or the possible consequences of such an action, they asked my opinion as to the risks associated. This placed me in a real quandary. At the time, the US was literally under siege. We have mentioned some of the target year activities, such as kill of the Aero DC-8, flameout offset engines early in 1985, target practice against shuttle launches at Cape Canaveral in November 1985, etc. Actually, kill of targets had continued in 1986. A huge earthquake followed by several large aftershocks had been used against Mexico City on September 19, 1985, causing great damage and demonstrating a little of what might be expected when they chose to hit Los Angeles and San Francisco much harder. The Mexico City quake had been preceded by an induced, giant hailstorm weeks earlier, and on the evening of September 18, 1985 by giant radial cloud signatures accompanying the generation of excess energy in the underlying rocks as the KGB prepared next day's giant Mexico City quake. The reader should recall that, working with Sweet during this period, I knew with certainty which earthquakes were natural and which were man-made. US missiles and aircraft had been hit, the Challenger had been destroyed, and the Titan 34D had been destroyed at Vandenberg AFB on April 18, 1986, accompanied by a 100% indicator, the substantiated presence of the marker beacon for registration and shift firing. In addition, a little Richter 5.3 quake in the San Francisco Bay Area had been induced by the Soviets on March 31, 1986, a quake which was correlated with preparatory activity on the woodpecker transmitter signals the day before, showing Soviet induction of the energy to create the quake. Again, we had instrumental evidence that it was man-made. That quake on March 31 had been a warm-up and practice for the big one now about to be induced in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, and along the San Andreas Fault. In fact, it appeared that the entire fault zone would be stimulated by deposit of excess energy all along its length. In that case, induction of a distributed California quake of unprecedented extent and great magnitude was now in process, though just beginning. If that event or those events occurred, the loss of American lives and property would be staggering. The high side risk factor. The group's query to me presented a very difficult decision situation. Such huge Soviet interferometer beams, once built up, contain enormous longitudinal electromagnetic wave energy. If a Soviet transmitter were near large nuclear facilities, and were instantly blown and shorted, all that potential energy might flash directly into the ground. In case of such a catastrophic transmitter failure, an enormously powerful longitudinal wave pulse would spread out in all directions in the surrounding Earth. The first nuclear material the pulse encountered would be fissioned abruptly and very violently. If the transmitter were within a few kilometers of one or more of the large monster Soviet ICBM sites, the full-up explosion of several 30 or 40 megaton warheads might result in the dirt and dirty. The resulting fallout and contamination would be massive, would spread round the world, and would eventually kill millions for years to come. Nuclear reactor stations were a similar risk. Instant fission of all the fissionable material in one of them would constitute an unprecedented and giant nuclear explosion, in the dirt and dirty. That was the high side risk. The low side risk factor. The low side risk would be that little or nothing at all would happen, perhaps a tremor induced in a nearby fault zone, etc. I knew that the Soviets after an early KYSHTYM transmitter failure had produced such a flashover on a much smaller scale and that flashover had caused the nuclear explosion of nearby stored nuclear wastes. The resulting fallout contaminated some 1,200 square kilometers, which is still contaminated to this day. I also knew that, after KYSHTYM, the Soviets had installed safety devices on all their scalar interferometer transmitters in case of such failures. So if the safety devices held when the transmitter suddenly shorted out, they could hold the longitudinal M-wave beams and potentials long enough to drain the energy slowly and harmlessly into the Earth over an extended period. That was the low side risk. The most likely consequence, of course, would be somewhere in the middle, between the extreme upper risk and lower risk limits. In other words, we could expect some bad repercussions in the Soviet Union almost certainly, but hopefully it would mostly be confined to that spot. Consequences of not taking counter-fire action. If no action were taken, the risk to the US was appalling. If the transmitters continued, then perhaps 200,000 Americans were going to die in Los Angeles and San Francisco and along the San Andreas Fault. Perhaps 300,000 more Americans would be injured, and many of them would also die. Enormous physical damage would also be done, and those basins would be disaster areas for some years to come. It would be interpreted by our inadequate scientific community as a great natural disaster caused by a giant earthquake, and the ghost of Khrushchev would have had one more laugh at us, with his words, "We will bury you," silently ringing in the ether. My recommendation to the counter-fire group: to save those American lives, some reasonable element of risk had to be accepted. In other words, it became a classic risk-to-benefit military analysis, but one that was deadly serious. To me, as a military person, the medium risk had to be accepted in such case. I gave the group my reasoning. They then asked what I would personally do if my own finger were on the fire switch. I answered that I would take out the transmitter or transmitters and save those American lives, accept the medium risk, trust in God, and pray for the best. Military decisions often have to be made in just such uncertain conditions. If one's military could not make such tough decisions, then one's military forces would inevitably lose their wars. The group fired and took out a transmitter. The group thanked me, stated that they would fire, and hung up the phone. They did fire on April 25, just as they promised, and they did destroy one of the KGB transmitters apparently located some kilometers, perhaps 30, from the Soviet nuclear reactors at Chernobyl. At the moment the transmitter was hit and destroyed, engineer Bill Bees out in the field with magnetic field detectors and measuring the woodpecker beams observed the abrupt failure of the woodpecker transmitter beam coming around the Earth from the east. Thus, he actually detected the successful destruction of that distant interferometer transmitter. Unknowingly he had detected the results of a great counter-strike in a very dangerous strategic battle. April 25, 1986. Bill Bees detects loss of east-west woodpecker transmitter. Safety circuits kick in. Chernobyl shuts down nuclear reactors. April 26, 1986. Safety circuits fail. Potential flash discharges. Strikes nearest reactor. Uranium fuel rods flare in fission. Ruptures container. Spews out nuclear material. Results at the transmitter and at Chernobyl. We were very, very lucky. At the destroyed transmitter site, the safety circuits kicked in and caught the huge beam potential and held it for about 24 hours, gradually draining down the intense beam energy into the Earth in a slow manner all the while. A frantic Russian message to the Chernobyl reactors galvanized the operators to immediately shut down those reactors, put in the cadmium control rods. However, the uranium in the fuel rods was of course still sitting there. Chernobyl then waited with bated breath to see if the safety circuits would hold. Then on April 26, the safety circuits at the transmitter site finally crumbled, and a far weaker longitudinal wave flashover occurred than would have occurred earlier without the safety. The spreading longitudinal waves in the Earth struck the nearest reactor core at Chernobyl, preceded seconds before by a tremor induced in the Earth at Chernobyl as the longitudinal waves arrived. Part of the struck uranium in the core fissioned immediately, venting the containment structure and spewing out radioactive material. Nuclear fallout spread over much of Europe. The rest of the disaster is well known. That unknown group, in my estimation, saved a large number of American lives, at least 200,000 or more, and perhaps as many as 300,000. They also prevented enormous physical damage to California, both to Los Angeles and San Francisco and to points in between. The members of that group are the unsung heroes of this bizarre episode. It is my hope that I may live to turn the names of those persons in for the award of a very high presidential medal. Until then I will not reveal those names under any circumstance. Whether or not the U.S. scientific and intelligence communities know it or believe it is of no concern. What matters is that a great many Americans are still alive, and their children born since then are alive. Those Americans otherwise would have been very, very dead or never born. I personally have reflected on those desperate circumstances many times. If I had it to do over again, I would unhesitatingly urge the same action, fire and save those American lives, and accept the medium risk. And pray. And I did pray after recommending the strike. In my opinion, this time my fervent prayers were answered. I am extraordinarily sorry for the civilian deaths that occurred. All one can say is that it was under severe circumstances and in a very peculiar and very desperate war. The Soviets had many other interferometers online. They induced a substantial earthquake in Mexico at the end of April. Thus they did complete their earthquake footsteps of the milestone. On May 7 they induced a 7.7 Richter quake in the Aleutian Islands. If 7.7 to 9.5 quakes had hit all along the San Andreas Fault in Los Angeles and San Francisco and in between, then the destructive scenario I had envisioned for the West Coast would have occurred. Bottling up shield practice over Atlanta, November 12, 1986. With a real shield, aircraft or missiles flying into it, from inside or from outside, explode and are destroyed. Other clouds moving with wind approximately 20 miles per hour west to east. Clouds leaving or joining arc. Upper edge irregular. Stationary arc of clouds. Well-defined lower edge. On November 12, 1986 the Soviets even placed a giant dummy shield, practice, over Atlanta, Georgia. If the shield had been real and not just practice, any aircraft and missiles flying into it would have been instantly exploded and destroyed. That mode, bottling up a strategic weapons area, is useful to nullify an entire strategic intercontinental ballistic missile launch complex or a large bomber base, etc. It can also bottle up a large carrier task force at sea, including the aircraft and the Tomahawk missiles, the shells from the naval guns, etc. Kill of the Challenger included use of metal softening, as we mentioned. During that 1986 preparation period the Russians also destroyed the Challenger spacecraft, January 28, 1986. Numerous signatures abounded, all of which we have already published. A few weeks before the kill of the Challenger, a close colleague had experimentally proven that a metal softening signal was indeed placed on the Russian woodpecker signals. He did this quite simply. He wired himself into a receiver, through an intervening amplifier, and tuned the receiver to the woodpecker signals. Then he took nails from a can of nails he was using, and hit them with a hammer to drive them into planks. The nails all folded up instantly like totally wet noodles. A couple dozen, one right after the other. Simultaneously, his son, who was not connected to the Soviet signal, was pounding nails from the same box, normally and without difficulty. None of the nails picked up and pounded by his son experienced any difficulty or softness. Then my friend disconnected himself from the signal, and waited a bit. Whereupon, when he then used nails from that same box, he drove them in without difficulty. There were no more wet noodle nails. We reach a very simple conclusion: when he connected to an amplified woodpecker signal, his body was time excitation charged, quick charge and quick decay, with a specific signal so that the nails he picked up were charged. Then when hit with the hammer, the nails acted as if made of very limp rubber without a rebound. When he disconnected from the amplified woodpecker signal, and waited a moment for the induced charge in his body to dissipate, the nails also discharged their engines and quit acting like limp rubber bands when hit, and became normal nails with normal behavior. That would seem to be quite sufficient to prove the thesis. The Challenger was then destroyed, as we previously printed, with numerous signatures of the hit, including even a KGB party in Moscow to celebrate the success of killing the vehicle, and getting away with it. Cold molding, an epilogue to the metal softening Donnybrook. I was called a total lunatic for pointing out a metal softening capability on the Russian signals. So be it. Metal softening is achieved by an engine which serves as a pumped phase conjugate mirror for the vibrations and signals in the lattice bonds of metals. Build up that engine in the metal until the precisely reversed and overlaid signals negate the normal signals, and one has dissolved the lattice bonds, converting the solid to a liquid. Lattice bond cancellation is not heating. But that was not to be the end of the metal softening story. A few years later, working informally with a large UK aerospace firm for free, I furnished them an address in Moscow of some Russian scientists associated on the perimeter of the KGB energetics weapon program. The address had been taken from their cautious advertisement for business on the internet and furnished to me by a correspondent. A UK engineer fluent in Russian was sent to meet with those scientists in Russia. They nervously showed him several novel things, one of which was cold molding of metal. They liquefied the metal without heating, poured it in a mold, and waited for the effect to wear off and the liquid to turn back into a solid again. Briefly, an energetics charge, using longitudinal waves, was induced on the metal lattice vibrations, adding their phase conjugate replicas to the interior longitudinal waves comprising the lattice bond signals. The metal's atoms were time density charged to an excited state, presently not recognized in Western science. Thereupon the metal lattice electromagnetic forces dissolved and the metal became liquid at room temperatures and without heating. The cool liquid metal was then poured into a mold. Then after a while, the time density charge and slowly drained away, and the metal resumed its normal solid state, all without any heating whatsoever. On a subsequent trip, the engineer brought that Russian team itself out of Russia and to the UK. The Russian scientists demonstrated cold molding to assembled UK scientists, and to some US visitors. The phenomenon was physically demonstrated and proven. I was correct about the metal softening then. We were also correct back there in 1986 about the metal softening signal employed against the Challenger, together with several other things. There are numerous other signatures on the death of the Challenger. Again, the death of the Challenger was not an accident. It was due to a deliberate act of war by the KGB. The KGB knew in advance, after substantial probing incidents, that they would get away with it. And they did so. Additional update from year 1998 to year 2000 has been given in the action package we sent to the Department of Defense in 1998. We told the rest of the KGB energetics weapons story up to that date. We gave the attack plans as we saw them and the most useful types of attacks to be expected. I hope the reader is interested in this special energetics weapons information. High-power microwave weapons, high-energy lasers, and nuclear weapons are useful but no longer decisive weapons either strategically or on the battlefield against a foe equipped with such energetics weapons, and particularly against a foe equipped with quantum potential weapons and negative energy electromagnetic pulse weapons. At present, we are intensely watching to see if we can pick up indicators for the next scheduled strategic attack, its probable timing, and the new twists included in it. Presently, we have perhaps an 80% chance that the little nation can once again counter any new threat and cause the KGB to abort the impending attack. On the other hand, with Putin apparently limiting at least some action off KGB, we have moved into our present asymmetrical warfare against terrorism and ultimately against the extensive terrorist teams and assets already infiltrated into our homeland. As a single example, before the collapse of the former Soviet Empire, the Russians long ago slipped in nuclear weapons, from 20 to 40 kilotons, and hid them in all our large cities and population centers, along with the Spetsnaz teams to detonate them on command. Several nations have introduced teams with normal sabotage assets and also with weapons of mass destruction such as radioactive nuclear materials, for a dirty bomb, anthrax, smallpox, bubonic plague, etc. Behind the scenes, the die-hard remnant of the old KGB crew are using quantum potential weapons to spread the immune systems of our populace and materially enhance any biological warfare strikes that the terrorists unleash. The rogue Japanese team, Yakuza and Aum Shinrikyo, on site in Russia are using their longitudinal wave interferometers in a giant weather war and the occasional kill of an aircraft, etc. Over the decades Castro infiltrated some 10,000 guerrilla special forces types trained in camps in southern Mexico for decades. Probably at least half are still loyal and dedicated and waiting to blow up bridges, power substations, high-voltage power distribution system towers, dams, harbor facilities, refineries, pipelines, both oil and gas, etc. The first phase of World War III delivery of the weapons of destruction and mass destruction to the targets along with means to unleash them has already been accomplished. We are particularly struggling against the rise of asymmetrical warfare, the superpowers paradox, and our present involvement in that new kind of warfare is still quite foreign to us. Only time will tell how well we fare in this new type of war, which we will be engaged in for many years to come. Vice President Cheney rightly regards it as almost a state of perpetual warfare we shall have to learn to live with, as shown by his words on October 21, 2001, "The war on terrorism will not be over in our lifetime. It is different than the Gulf War was in the sense that it may never end. At least not in our lifetime. The way I think of it is, it's a new normalcy. The superpower paradox, asymmetric cheap weapons of mass destruction, strategic strikes and destruction, later becoming extremely high-tech and extreme yield. There is also a severe bioenergetics, biological warfare, threat. The threat from bioenergetics is equally vivid. That old die-hard section of the KGB can now attack an entire population, for example, with electrodynamically, energetics, induced diseases of any kind whatsoever, particularly when using quantum potential weapons. Such attacks are totally immune to inoculations and antibiotic treatment. Any kind of strain or variation of a disease can also be induced in the pathogen pool for that disease. Against a foe who has such capabilities, our entire medical establishment, including all our emergency treatment procedures and agents, is obsolete right now. A vaccination and the presence of antibodies, for example, does absolutely nothing against the electromagnetic induction of the exact physical effects and form of a disease, as shown in the decades-long microwave radiation of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. To the assistant to the Secret Defense in such matters, in 1998 we furnished a 200-plus page briefing package and loosely proposed a crash development of the new type of medical therapeutic treatment devices pioneered and proven by the Priori Group in France in the 1960s and early 1970s. Later, Congressman Kramer queried that office for an answer. Unfortunately, the assistant SEC-DEF's office erroneously responded to Congressman Kramer that nothing in the literature supported the mechanisms proposed. Indeed, the package we furnished contained a detailed list citing the hard French scientific papers in the literature, reporting the exact experiments and the astounding results obtained. Some 2,000 highly successful animal experiments for more than a decade of experiments in fact supported the thesis, and higher group symmetry electrodynamics fully supports the ability to use electromagnetic means to make space-time curvature engines, so that these engines then interact back upon the targeted matter to perform the actions desired. That it does not appear in conventional electrical engineering is of no consequence, it appears in physics and it is good physics, just on the cutting edge. We also reported, explained, and cited Becker's epical work, which is copiously published in the hard literature and which was an example of the fundamental mechanism also. Becker was twice nominated for a Nobel Prize for his outstanding work. Unfortunately, the assistant SEC-DEF's office responded with a non sequitur. Packages were sent also to NIH, NSF, CDC, and several other government agencies. Not a single one of those agencies was interested enough to have a competent scientist contact me and discuss the area. I strongly doubt that a single scientist anywhere in the government bothered to seriously read and ponder the material so painfully and expensively compiled and furnished. Lieutenant Colonel, retired, Ken Moore and I worked our fingers to the bone for weeks, preparing that briefing, and we spent all the spare money doing it that we could rake up and obtain. The near total lack of response itself seems astounding, but it clearly shows the state of U.S. science with respect to novel energetics innovations, even long after those innovations have been experimentally proven and documented in the hard literature, and even after they have been weaponized against us. It is a direct indication of why the U.S. never deciphered what was going on in some 4 decades of Soviet-weak microwave radiation of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, including the eventual deaths, of 3 U.S. ambassadors. For decades there have been manipulations, to say the least, in the hotly contested field of the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation. We refer the interested reader to an excellent expose of that situation. The expose is by Dr. Andrew A. Marino, Ph.D., J.D., Powerline Electromagnetic Fields and Human Health, which is current. I believe it can be freely downloaded from http://www.ortho.lsumc.edu/faculty/marino/powerline-toc.html. Dr. Marino has been personally and deeply involved in the investigation of electromagnetic bioethics, in court cases, and in blue ribbon panel investigations and proceedings. The book is an eye-opener, and it gives one a good view of the machinations in the electromagnetic bioethics field. We quote directly from Dr. Marino, Chap 6, P1, oversimplistic as it may sound, whoever pays for electromagnetic field bioethics research and analysis determines what data is produced and the way it is interpreted. Soon after the possibility that power-line electromagnetic fields were health risks was raised in a legal dispute involving the New York Public Service Commission, power companies and their trade associations, particularly the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, became massively involved in electromagnetic bioethics research. Subsequently, the power industry dominated funding of the effects of power-line electromagnetic fields, both in terms of absolute dollars and compared with dollars from non-industry sources. The power companies and their trade associations were deeply deceitful regarding the information they provided to scientists and to the public regarding the potential health hazards of power-line electromagnetic fields. In the entire electromagnetic bioethics field, there does not appear to be any mention of, study of, or recognition of electromagnetic bioethics induced by the most powerful electromagnetic factors: longitudinal electromagnetic wave irradiation, time-polarized electromagnetic wave irradiation, and time excitation charging of particles throughout the body and its cells, with resulting emission of transduced longitudinal and transverse electromagnetic radiation from within to without. National Institute of Health Reaction NIH replied to my letter and action package from their policy read, spin control section. They noted that the package mentioned the Gulf War syndrome, which was not in their mission area. So they just sent it off packing to Dodd, simplest way to get rid of it. Apparently no one seriously read it or even cared to read it. I queried them back by separate response letter about their lack of interest in a revolutionary proven new medical methodology well documented to cure cancer and other dread diseases, in many hundreds of experiments by leading French medical scientists. This was certainly within their mission area. They hastily replied from the policy section that, yes, of course NIH was interested in all such things, and told me where to submit a proposal. We never got out of their policy department. Again, not a single competent scientist in the US's supposed master medical agency apparently even read the package or cared to call and discuss the matter. This was an indicator of their total lack of any grasp of the energetics threat, its testing, and its use to induce the Gulf War disease. Now perhaps one can see why we are so far behind the KGB energetics weapons scientists and weapons program. Marino, Ibid, is particularly enlightening on the adamant opposition by appropriate sections of NIH vis-a-vis the harmful effect of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation. No responses at all were received from the NSF and the CDC, or the other U.S. government agencies to which the package was furnished. The CDC of course comes under NIH, and thus its responses or lack thereof would be dictated by the parent NIH policies. As for the NSF, Marino, Ibid, again is enlightening on the qualifications or lack thereof of its membership. So as the reader can see, the top of the medical establishment in this nation is flatly not interested in any controversial or out-of-the-box proven method for curing cancer, dread diseases, and mass treatment of those millions of American casualties that are coming in our cities and population centers. Again, they directly ignore scientific method's very premise. If the experiment is replicated and contradicts the theory, accept the experiment and change the theory. I personally concluded that the U.S. medical establishment largely does not follow scientific method, but follows dogma and the already approved methodologies. How the new revolution in medical healing works. For the reader who is a medical scientist and trained in physiology and biology, one might be interested in that revolutionary French therapeutic methodology and how it worked, before it was ruthlessly suppressed in the early 1970s. Priori's apparatuses simply pump the cells of the entire body with longitudinal electromagnetic waves, each accompanied of course by its time-polarized twin, in a Whittaker pairing. The cells and every part of them are very nonlinear, so they act as pump phase conjugate mirrors for Whittaker wave pair engines resident in the cells and acting as input signal complexes. Once the cells are pumped by these now established time density waves, the damaged or diseased cellular masses slowly charge up with excess time excitation. The irradiation took several hours, and this was the activation or time excitation charging stage. Thereafter, the time charge decayed slowly, all the while constituting pumping of every cell and every part of it, in the time domain. The resident engine in the cell contains two components, 1, the normal or healthy component, and 2, the abnormal component representing disease or debility. Pumping these two components time reverses both of them and amplifies that reversal. This creates amplified and incredibly precise anti-engines in each cell and in each part of each cell. These anti-engines override the weaker cellular engines resident. In turn, this reversing action of the anti-engines causes the pumped cellular masses, actually the mass energy, in its exact structure and dynamics, at any and all levels, including the genetics, to be time reversed back to normal. In biological instead of physics terms, it dedifferentiated the diseased or altered cells back to a previous healthy state by simply eliminating the diseased engine component. This is a dramatic extension of nonlinear optical phase conjugation from the three-space pumping domain to pumping in the complex, time, plane, and it is effective for time reversing mass energy at any and all frequencies. We accent that the cellular time reversal back to a previous state includes all the cell's genetics and every part of the cell no matter how small. Block diagram of priorize healing, regenerative and time reversing process. Select a set of transverse electromagnetic waves. Mix waves in a plasma, convert to longitudinal electromagnetic waves. Mix output inside strong pulse DC magnetic field. Expose whole body of patient to dimensioned magnetic field. Cell and all its parts are pumped in inner electromagnetic channel in time domain. Diseased cell phase conjugates its vacuum engine. Forms amplified vacuum anti-engine for cell's disease vacuum engine. Time excitation charging ends, irradiation is halted. Normal cells are just backed up to a slightly younger condition. Diseased cells have their abnormal engine component overridden and reversed back to zero, its earlier state, so that only a slightly younger normal engine remains resident in the cell. This simultaneously reverses the cellular masses back to their previous healthy condition. Contrast this direct healing mechanism to the action of the immune system. The immune system itself does not heal anything. It contains the killers, the scavengers, the locators, the markers, the attackers, and the troops manning the ramparts. Usually after a fierce battle with invading hostile pathogens, it wins. Lots of cells still living are damaged in the melee. The immune system scavenger cells then scavenge up the residue littering the battlefield. But the immune system itself cannot heal and restore a single damaged cell, including one of its own. That healing and restoration of damaged cells is the job of the regenerative system, still little known and inadequately studied today. Perhaps the most fundamental studies were mostly by Becker et al. Some decades ago. The regenerative system is an electromagnetic system in its operation, as clearly shown by Becker, yet it is able to physically differentiate and dedifferentiate cells from one form to another at will, and in highly selective fashion. The regenerative system acts within its limitations. Only weak pumping can be done for the time reversal of diseased or damaged cells, to eliminate the delta, the deviation from normal of the resident engines in the pumped cell. That restores the normal, healthy, engine and slightly amplifies it as well. It is obviously of the utmost medical importance to understand and apply, and amplify, this little-known technical mechanism by which the regenerative system is able to restore damaged cells back to normal. It turns out that the regenerative system in its novel electromagnetic functioning uses precisely longitudinal waves and time density wave pumping of those damaged cells and gradually time reverses their entire masses back to a normal healthy state, within its limitations. This is the secret of the mechanism of the cellular regenerative system, which is an electrodynamic system of very unusual nature. The exact mechanism has not previously appeared in the literature. It took me 14 years to uncover that fundamental mechanism, and another 4 or 5 to refine it a bit, even though both Priori and Becker, as well as others, applied it decades before without being able to fully decipher it. The experimental proof is already in the literature, once one understands the higher topology electromagnetics unwittingly used by both Becker and the Priori team. The proper types of higher group symmetry electrodynamics required to understand the action of the cellular regenerative system are available. There exist scientists skilled in their application and use. These scientists and that higher group symmetry electrodynamics are little used, and are never used at all in the medical field. There exists no funding anywhere for higher electromagnetic examination and modeling of the functioning of the cellular regenerative system, i.e., for the fundamental healing process. Just imagine what this could mean to medicine. One can now develop a new medical science to amplify and apply nature's own proven method of restoration and healing of damaged cells, including all their damaged genetic material. It matters not what caused the damage, whether pathogen or gamma radiation, whatever. This new therapeutic method is a totally new general relativistic process where powerful space-time engines are created which work directly upon the damaged cell and every part of it, physically reversing the cell and all its parts precisely back to normal condition. General relativity rigorously tells us that a precise space-time curvature engine, set of precise space-time curvatures, is present and active for every specific disease condition and every nuance in it. It also tells us this flawed, disease or damage-carrying engine, continuously operates on the cellular mass at every level, maintaining the exact physical condition of the cell and its dynamics. By creating a precise anti-engine and amplifying and applying it, general relativity assures us that we are physically acting upon the cell and all its parts at every level, down to the smallest, to precisely return every part in perfect proportion back to a previous normal healthy condition. Potrizal directly proved the time reversal to an actual earlier state of the cells and the organism. Amplification by time domain electromagnetic pumping means that we can cause this time reversal of the cells back to normal to happen much more quickly than can the body itself, which can only pump very weakly. Professor Raymond Potrizal, renowned parasitologist. Potrizal's proof of time reversal of the stricken cells back to a previous state. Potrizal compared identical treatment of immature rats with immature immune systems, and mature rats with mature immune systems. Treatment restored the damaged mature system back to full mature functioning, and it promptly recognized and dispatched the pathogens. Treatment restored the damaged immature system back to full immature functioning, unable to cope, and the pathogens promptly reinfected and killed the immature rat. The lesson: the body is indeed returned to a previous physical state. The pathogens themselves are not killed by the treatment, but by restoring the ability of the immune system to recognize and destroy them. Only the previous ability of the immune system is restored by the process. General relativity also assures us that any and every disease is subject to this novel treatment approach, even diseases which have resisted every other known therapy. The Sachs unified general relativity and electrodynamics, and general relativity electromagnetic unification applications in O3, electrodynamics produced by Evans, for the first time provide a solid theoretical basis for Priori's methodology and his evolutionary results. They also offer direct engineering of startling physical cures, once the technology is developed. The profound implications of that treatment can be seen. Apparently, however, our leading governmental agencies and health agencies do not see it, do not wish to see it, have no appreciation for general relativistic effects in healing, and do not intend to have any appreciation for general relativistic effects in healing. Indeed, they seem totally uninterested in even trying to comprehend and research the fundamental healing mechanism demonstrated by nature herself. What the French researchers showed, among other things, the Priori team produced revolutionary cures of terminal tumors, infectious trypanosomiasis, suppressed immune systems, and atherosclerosis in several thousand laboratory animals in rigid laboratory tests under rigorous protocols. Eminent scientists such as Robert Courrier and Raymond Potrizal worked with the Priori team. Courrier was head of the biology section of the French Academy of Sciences at the time, also secrétaire perpetuel of the Academy, and a noted scientist of high stature. Courrier personally presented the astounding Priori results to the entire assembled French Academy. He also sent his own most able scientist assistant to personally prepare the terminal tumor grafts on the lab animals before their treatment. A world-renowned parasitologist who did enormously important work with Priori was Raymond Potrizal, who is still alive at this writing though quite aged. Potrizal was greatly persecuted for his years of determination and effort. Courtesy of Potrizal via the late Christopher Bird, I personally have the very PhD thesis that Priori himself submitted to the University of Bordeaux on his revolutionary work. That thesis was maliciously rejected in the suppression that was applied to the project. When the French government changed to a leftist government in the mid-70s, government support was immediately withdrawn and the project was ruthlessly suppressed. Priori later sickened and died, and that was the end of that. More than a decade later, a brave and determined Potrizal finally was able to get a doctoral thesis approved in the Priori work area, at the same university, by another doctoral candidate, Eric Paris. There are 2 US patents on the Priori device itself, and of course several French patents also. All the above was rigorously documented in the 1998 package prepared and submitted by Ken Moore and I. While Priori was still alive, a team with which I was connected attempted to mount a well-funded effort to restore the priori methodology while priori was still alive. We also were viciously suppressed. The lives of our financial backers and their families were threatened. The head of our project was viciously attacked financially and destroyed, fleeing the country for his very life. Whoever thinks that dramatically innovative medical science in this country is just sweet reason and scientific method, should have a strong enema to remove the serious blockages interfering with his perceptions. This vicious outside suppression of our project so infuriated me that I made a solemn promise that, were it humanly possible, I would decipher the priori process before I died. It took 14 years, but we made good on that promise. During the 20 years or so since our project was suppressed, it is heartbreaking to consider the millions of children and sickened and suffering people who could have been saved had the project continued and succeeded. It is heartbreaking now to consider the coming millions of casualties in our civilian populace in our cities, most of who are going to die from mass destruction weapons. And most of those would not have to die, would the scientific community waken from its long sleep and discover some modern physics and higher group symmetry electrodynamics and their application to solve nature's mechanism for healing. When one time reverses the body's cells and all their parts, one forces the diseased cells to dedifferentiate back to healthy state. We strongly accent that this is accomplished by unified general relativity electromagnetic processes involving precisely organized space-time curvatures and their local actions in the cells and all their inner components, down to the finest level. It can be rigorously expressed in good unified physics, as expressed in an electrodynamics such as O3. The non-damaged or non-diseased cells just get a little younger. That is also highly beneficial, it reverses the ravages of aging, just a little. Indeed, one of the implications of the priori mechanism is that aging can indeed be reversed by the process and treatment. Again, one must keep one's sense of humor. In order to get this technology and therapeutic method born, what seems to be needed is an extremely wealthy person, strongly desiring to live longer than the expected lifespan and do it in a vigorous, healthy body, and who is willing to fund the project with the necessary $60 million required so to redevelop and extend the priori technology so it can be readily applied. A byproduct will be the saving of millions of American lives when those coming mass casualties from weapons of mass destruction occur in our cities.